www.booktvbooks.org. Coming up next on Book TV, David Graeber, author of Debt, The First 5,000 Years, discusses the impact of debt on the world over thousands of years, with Doug Henwood, the author of Wall Street and After the New Economy. This is just over an hour.
I feel a little intimidated by the 5,000-year perspective, and by starting with a very mundane and 5 seconds ago in the historical time frame kinds of question. But I was reading the New York Times a few weeks ago, and I learned something, as I often do from reading the New York Times. There's a piece about the debt limit melodrama in there. And the reporter explained, I think this was a think piece, as they like to call it in journalism. The reporter explained that the parties were fighting over the moral high ground. And I scratched my head at that a little bit, because I didn't see very much moral high ground evidence at that point. But there was also an interesting point that's was inadvertently being made by the reporter, I think, that an awful lot of discourse around debt is about morality, and austerity, which frequently follows the bursting of a bubble, is often presented as a kind of moral renovation, a program of moral renovation. Certainly bubbles in the past have been followed by periods of self-flagellation and what were we thinking kinds of things. But David, you write a lot about debt and morality, and one pays one debt to society. There's a whole lot of language around that. But how did debt, which conventionally is thought of as just this kind of very narrowly defined economic mechanism, get so wrapped up with issues of morality?
Well, we don't really know, because it seems to have happened so early, it's almost beyond the reach of the historical record. But the very earliest documents seem to already have them conflated. I mean, in Hebrew and Sanskrit and Aramaic, the words for debt, sin, and guilt are actually the same word. It's a really curious thing, because in almost all of the ancient religions, they almost invariably start the same way. It's much like Plato's Republic starts, what is justice? Well, is it not just a matter of paying your debts? No, actually it isn't. So they almost immediately conclude that doesn't work, and then the rest of the book is trying to figure out if not that, then what. World religions are exactly the same. They start by saying morality is just debt, it's the same thing. Then they say, but wait, that doesn't really work. So what it ends up being varies a lot. And the Brahmanas, for example, a lot of the Sanskrit texts, they end up concluding that recognizing that you don't really owe a debt to the cosmos, to your parents, is actually the way you resolve it. In the Bible, it's all about forgiveness, or debt cancellation becomes a metaphor for true morality. But the interesting thing is they feel they have to start that way. The conclusion I finally came to is that the only really way to explain it would be that they're stuck with this language because that was the language of politics and power at the time. We don't really know what people in ancient Mesopotamia or ancient India were arguing about in bars when they talked politics. But it seems, from all the evidence that we have, that that was it, and that we have this language and these leftover political debates that we don't really know anymore what exactly they were. Where debt and the language of debt forgiveness, reckoning, redemption, was the everyday language of politics, and it got swept into this moral language, and it's been left with us ever since. I think the reason why is because debt forms a kind of a moral trap. It's the language of power, because people in power have always discovered that it's the easiest way to take a situation of pure, arbitrary, violent authority and make it seem like the victim is to blame. I mean, mafiosi understand this, conquering armies understand this. You have power over somebody, you've just conquered them. The easiest thing to do is to say, well, look, you guys owe us your lives because we didn't kill you. We're going to demand this, name something they can't possibly pay, and then say, well, I'm going to be a nice guy. I'll let you off the hook this month, but next month definitely. And suddenly you have the moral high ground. They're a bunch of schmoes, and they have to run around feeling rotten about themselves. The only way to reply to that is to say, now wait a minute, who owes what to who? Which is, in fact, what people almost invariably did. And what we discover is actually, while it was a very effective way of reframing power relations to make it seem like the victims are to blame, to the extent that probably most people who've ever lived, I would guess, have been told they were debtors at some point in their lives. it's also the focus of the vast majority of insurrections and rebellions that have happened over world history. Moses Finley once said that there was basically one revolutionary program in all of antiquity: cancel the debts and redistribute the land, in that order. So that reply, now wait a minute, who owes what to who, does happen all the time, but once you say that, of course, you're using the language of debt. So people were stuck with that argument about what is debt, who owes what to whom, and the great moral philosophers kind of have to start with that language, if only to then try to transcend it and kick it away.
You mentioned the Jubilee year. I remember when Pat Robertson was running for president back in, I think, 1988, he suggested that we have a Jubilee year. We revive that tradition, which
Excellent,
of course
yeah.
disqualified him as a serious candidate for president, prompted stern lectures in the Wall Street Journal editorial page. But that tradition, certainly Christian morality is very prominent in our politics, but that little bit of it seems to have disappeared.
It's interesting, isn't it? The other part of Pat Robertson's program, where he argued that the Federal Reserve system of money creation is actually the first divine system of money creation, because just making up money and giving it to capitalists reproduces the divine act of creation and shows
Ex
it
nihilo, right?
Yeah, ex nihilo. It's not a materialist thing. We understand now that money isn't materialist.
It says in God we trust in our money, right?
Yeah.
Credit comes from credere, to believe.
To believe, yeah.
So it's deeply wrapped up with matters of faith.
And he recognized that. He just took it a little too seriously for the people in charge.
Yeah. But another element of religious tradition, many religions have frowned on usury. And now that seems to be largely forgotten as well. What happened?
Well, that's a really interesting story. And in fact, one of the things that came out when I was researching this book, and I guess you could say it's one of my major discoveries, is that history seems to flow back and forth between periods dominated by virtual credit money and periods where gold and silver are assumed to be what money really is, and where coins or some other material object, actual metal, is being used in everyday transactions. The funny thing is, we think this world of virtual credit money we're moving into now is this brave new world. It's completely unprecedented. Completely the opposite is true. It's the original form of money. In ancient Mesopotamia, they were basically doing most things by credit. Coinage was only invented maybe 2,000 years after the first accounts we have, for example, of compounded interest rates and things like that. However, in periods where you have credit as the main form of money, well, it's hard to think of money as something which is quite as set in stone as it is in periods where people are actually using physical stuff. So it's understood that money is a social creation, and therefore usually there's some mechanism to make sure the whole system doesn't go crazy. For example, the Jubilees, periodic cancellation. Mesopotamian kings often would simply cancel all debts on taking power. They just sort of, all right, new king, new world, new society, we'll just start over. That became institutionalized in the 7 or 49-year cycle in the Bible. But in the Middle Ages, which is another period of virtual credit money, it reverts to bullion. Debts are not generally forgiven during the period where bullion dominates, from maybe about 600 BC to maybe 600 AD. With the Middle Ages, the world goes back to credit systems, and once again you find some sort of vast cosmological overarching institutions designed to protect debtors. In this case, in Islam and in Christianity. Actually, Christianity was rather stricter than Islam at first. It was a complete ban on interest taking, along with other things like debt peonage that usually came along with it. It was considered critical to assure that society didn't polarize and split apart. The rise of the economic system we have now, which comes after 1492, the bullion comes sweeping back into Europe again. Actually, most of that bullion ends up in China, but it's swept through Europe on the way. They go back to an idea that money really is gold and silver. They change the whole idea of what money is. And interest sort of worms its way back in. And it's interesting how they did it. It was through a kind of subterfuge. The notion of interest actually goes back to the Latin interesse, interesse. But what it actually meant originally was a penalty for late payment. So the idea was, while renting money was a sin, you could charge people for not returning something by the date they said they would, because it was assumed that if these people being merchants, it starts with commercial law. If you had the money, you'd be putting it out to some profitable enterprise, so it would be growing at maybe 5% a year. Thus, they could pay you that in way of penalty. That was the sort of legal out they used.
Yeah, I think some Italian bankers invented very complex, what amount to derivatives instruments in, 13th or 14th century to disguise the payment of interest. So financial innovation goes back a very, very long way.
Mortgages were another way of doing that. If you don't want to, you can't officially charge interest, you can just say, okay, I'm buying your house and renting it back to you.
Well, now we do sale-leasebacks regularly. Now, this is funny, coming just after the news that Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs has hired a defense attorney. But, we did have this recent riot of profligacy, yet it seems like the ones who are being asked to pay their debt to society are not the profligate ones. The profligate ones are still living high on the hog, collecting interest.
Funny, isn't it?
How do they get away with that?
Well, all right. This is my reading. I mean, there's the obvious answer, but which is debts are social constructs, and debts between rich people have always been a little different than debts either between poor people and each other, where people tend to help each other out as a disguised form of mutual aid, or, but debts between rich and poor, they're kind of different. That's where the exact morality of debt really comes in. I mean, as I always say, rich people can be incredibly generous, understanding, and forgiving when dealing with each other, as we recently saw in 2008. Not so much when dealing with us. And this has always been true. The funny thing, though, is that we seem to be experiencing another turn of the cycle. And this is another one of my major conclusions in the book, actually. All right, we've had virtual credit money, and then it shifts to gold and silver. In the ancient world, what I call the axial age. You have a shift in the Middle Ages back to credit money, you have a shift back to bullion. It's turning again.
We just passed the 40th anniversary of Nixon severing
exactly.
gold.
Yeah, in 71, officially, the dollar was completely detached from gold, and since then, it's been happening at breakneck pace. We've had, plastic replacing currency in most everyday transactions. We've had, financialization of capital, and we've had the rise of 401ks and mortgages. Suddenly everyone's supposed to have credit. Credit's supposed to save the third world. There's microcredit. On all fronts, you seem to be moving towards both an ideology of credit and the actual use of virtual money.
And the American populist tradition's in love with easy credit.
Yeah, and it was the only thing saving us since wages were completely stagnating. Let them eat credit. But the problem was, when you go into a period of virtual credit money, as I was saying, historically what's always happened, well, you have two problems. One is like how to prevent this whole thing from spinning out of control. If money is just an IOU, if money is just a promise, well, what's to keep people from making any old kind of crazy promise? And even more, what's to prevent people from falling into debt traps and becoming effectively enslaved? And that was the great fear throughout most of human history. Our terrible moral disaster that would rip a society apart was a small percentage of the population essentially enslaves everybody else by trapping them into debt, and people are forced to sell off members of their family into slavery, often ultimately sell themselves. Now, there were always mechanisms to prevent that happening. The Jubilees, the anti-usury laws, there are various other things. Buddhists, for example, in the Middle Ages didn't believe in abolishing interest, but instead they invented the pawn shop. That was actually supposed to be a way of saving people from the local loan sharks. The first major pawn shops, were first of all in Buddhist temples in medieval China, and then the Franciscans adopted it in Europe. Now, what did we do this time around? Well, true, we're only 40 years into what's probably going to be a 500-year cycle if history runs true, so you can't necessarily expect we're really going to understand what's going on.
President Bachmann will bring back the gold standard.
She'll try. I'm not thinking she's going to do too well with that. But, what normally happens is you protect some sort of institution to protect debtors. What did they do? They did exactly the opposite. They set up these gigantic, the first global administrative system, if you want to think of it that way, because you have the IMF, you have the trade bureaucracies, the WTO, the EU, and NAFTA, various financial institutions. Now, what do these guys do? Instead of being there to protect debtors, they're there to protect creditors and to make sure that nobody ever defaults, which economically is insane.
Which is funny, because when Keynes conceived with the IMF, his idea that the burden of adjustment should be forced on the surplus creditors, not off the debtors, and it quickly got all turned around.
Exactly, they've turned it exactly around. And of course, Keynes had it right. He was following, Keynes actually studied Mesopotamian
He also declared himself a
economics.
moralist, too. So
Well,
it
okay.
fits.
Yeah. There's morality and there's morality. Yes. So what they did is exactly the opposite of what historically you would imagine they should have done. And the result was predictably catastrophic. First you have the third world debt crisis, and now that Latin America, East Asia have largely liberated themselves from the IMF, they just kicked them out, basically. The same thing is happening here. And in fact, another point I always like to make, that idea of the terrible debt crisis where 1 or 2% of the population becomes a creditor class and effectively enslaves everybody else. Well, look at the way most Americans are living. Everybody's in debt. Most people are working extra jobs, working in jobs they would otherwise never want to be in order to pay back those debts. If Aristotle were sort of magically whisked into the present, he would probably not take the distinction between renting yourself out to someone else to work for them and selling yourself to someone else to work for them as being more than a legal nicety. He would probably conclude most people are actually slaves.
But all those things you listed may have been catastrophic for the debtors. Well, they certainly were catastrophic for the debtors. But they've been very good for the creditors. And if we go back really to, I think, was the first modern debt crisis and austerity scheme, the New York City fiscal crisis of 1975, the bankers really essentially took over the city, cut back on social spending, cut back on the public sector, at least the benign things the public sector did. And we're quite conscious that if we can get away with this in New York, which is a very volatile environment where people have very high expectations, we can do this anywhere. There was an op-ed in the New York Times back in 1975 that said it pretty much in those words. That succeeded. And then you go to the Latin debt crisis of the 80s, and that was used as a lever to open up all these economies, open them up to trade and finance, privatization. It was really the club of neoliberalism.
Right.
It reminds me of that quote from Antonio Negri in one of his more lucid moments. He said, money has one face, that of the boss. So, the creditors have been very, very successful over the last 40 years or so, 35 or 40 years, in using debt to enslave and impoverish and increasing their own wealth and power. Do you think their run of luck is running out?
Yeah. I think 2008 sort of let the cat out of the bag because they can do this partly because people are still following the morality of a bullion-based money system, whereby it seems like debts have to be paid. What everybody discovered in 2008, where they basically blew up their own system out of sheer complete greed, is that debts don't have to be paid if you're big enough. And that's the lesson of a virtual credit money system. If money is just a promise, an IOU, why does it have greater moral standing than any other promise? Perhaps with the idea that, the argument would be, well, if you don't pay your debts, the whole economic system will fall apart. But in fact, the whole economic system did fall apart. And the culprits didn't have to pay their debts even then. So as a result, I think that people realize, there was a moment of lucidity right after the crash. In fact, people were willing to rethink almost anything. I remember even The Economist ran a headline saying, "Capitalism, was it a good idea?" It lasted about a month. And then they just put a big Band-Aid over the thing and said, okay, no, move along, nothing to see here. But, Band-Aids fall, and it's starting to happen. And I think people are came to the realization that, the line they've been telling us for all these years of neoliberalism is nonsense. The market doesn't run itself. Nobody could possibly believe that at this point, and debts don't really have to be repaid. And if they can make 13 trillion or whatever some estimate is, that sort of dark economy, that money that just was finagled away, if they can make that sort of money disappear, that kind of debts disappear, well, there's no reason they couldn't do the federal debt, my debt. It's all a political thing. It's a question of who has the most power. Now, once you realize that, then if democracy is to mean anything, it means everybody has to have a say over that. And I think that's exactly why you see these movements in Spain and Greece. That's what they're essentially saying, and that's why they're framing it as let us move back to grassroots democracy.
Well, but the dominant political discourse still seems to assume that the elderly need to tighten their belts and the poor need to give up Medicaid so that rich bankers can get another Jaguar. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any significant challenge to that orthodoxy yet. It may be falling apart or showing some signs of fraying, but
I think it depends on where you are. I mean, in Europe, they're a little bit ahead of us in terms of the austerity. We're seeing what things might well look like in a year and a half. I've been told by some friends who were recently in Greece that it's gotten to the point of what it was like in Argentina in 2001, when politicians basically couldn't go to the restaurant without wearing like false noses and mustaches and things. Of any political party, because people just attack them. Politicians can't go out on the street anymore in Greece. I think that might well happen once austerity actually hits.
A paper by a couple of economists who studied the European record over the last 40 years or so and found out that austerity programs lead to a great upsurge in riots. So,
gee, you think?
Yes, it's been proven by economists. Speaking of economists, in their marvelous little icy hearts, they've long had the view that money is very insignificant. There are a whole lot of almost cliches in the economics profession. Money is a veil, Irving Fisher said. I think it was John Stuart Mill who said there's nothing that could be more insignificant than money. The idea that money is neutral dominates mainstream economics. Wherever did that idea come from?
It's really odd because it has nothing to do with what economists actually do. Yeah, there's a sense that all economies are really barter economies. Money is this social contrivance whereby we make it a little more convenient, but it's not important. Look away, look away. Again, another one of those nothing to see here kind of moments. And it goes back to Adam Smith, actually. There's a fascinating story that we all learn about where money is supposed to come from. Originally, there's barter, and everybody's saying, I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow. You say, well, I don't really need chickens right now, so firewood maybe, eggs. Eventually, either you hit on something the guy needs or you have to invent money. And we all learn this. In fact, being an anthropologist is a kind of a personal, professional pet peeve because we've been looking for 150 years. If there's any place in the world they did that, we would have found it by now. There isn't. It's not true. They do lots of other things, but they never do that. And it's kind of amazing considering there really aren't that many things that nobody ever does. But there's one. Occasionally you see barter with people you hate or would just as soon kill or steal their stuff, but it isn't convenient right now. But in a society, no. So the question is why? And I think the real reason is because money is credit. Credit is a social relation, and early economists had a problem with credit.
They also had trouble with social relations.
Yeah, exactly, because it was social relations, exactly. In order to constitute economics as a domain unto itself, you have to say that, there is a sphere of human activity where people are just thinking about the stuff. Well, in normal human life, we're never just thinking about the stuff, or you have to create a sphere where people are just thinking about the stuff, which was kind of what economists were doing. Adam Smith and people like that came from a class where they thought you really should be able to walk into the butcher or the baker, just plunk down your cash, take your stuff, walk out, and never see the guy again and not even know his name, which was not the way it worked at the time. There's this great line in Adam Smith where he says it's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the baker that we expect our dinner, but rather a self-interest. The crazy thing is it wasn't true at the time. All transactions were on credit. People were asking favors of butchers and bakers all the time. But there was a feeling that they shouldn't. And that's why...
This was a period when Britain was run by a bunch of hard money nuts who didn't believe in coining too much, right?
Well, they had a problem with credit money. It's getting out of hand. The problem was they thought everybody should be using actual coins, but they didn't have the means to make them. It was really only 1830s and 40s where they actually managed to produce enough cash that people could actually go to the store and just buy things. For a long time, shops had to produce their own money. So why does Adam Smith tell this story? Because if you think about it, it makes no sense, right? Here's this guy, here's his neighbor, he wants his cow. He says, okay, I'll give you some chickens. The guy says no. Well, these guys are neighbors in a small Neolithic community, presumably. But the economists are assuming they will only interact with each other on the spot trade. Something for something right now when we walk away. what sense does that make? I mean, this guy's your neighbor. I mean, if you don't want his chickens, he's going to have something. And in fact, that's what really happens. You walk up and you say, hey, nice cow. The guy says, oh, you like it? Hey, it's yours. Don't even think about giving me anything back. Now you owe him one, right? And he's going to come later. So, say, my son is really in love with your daughter, or, nice shoes, or whatever he might come up with. So what you'd actually have is a rough informal credit system. But again, that involves things like my son is in love with your daughter, which kind of falls outside the domain of economics. So what they actually did was they made up this little story where everybody's just swapping stuff on the spot. And money comes in as a way of facilitating that. So hence money is always secondary and arises from the basic business, which is swapping stuff.
You say that in a lot of, what do we call them, pre-capitalist, traditional, older societies, money didn't really serve all that much of an economic function.
I call them human economies.
Yes, it had more almost a symbolic or a ritual value, and not the way we think of money now.
Yeah, because you do find cash, or things that are like cash, in a lot of stateless societies. You don't find markets, though, because if you look at wampum, wampum is a great example. Wampum was something very much like money for colonists.
That's what they bought the island across the road for $24.
Well, they hadn't invented wampum quite. They had beads, but they were glass beads at that point, yeah. Which seems to have been received as a sort of a token of goodwill, a gift of sort of rare exotica in exchange for usufruct rights. They didn't actually think they were selling it, but that's another story. But wampum, yeah, they eventually had the Pequot out in Long Island manufacturing the stuff before they massacred them, and using it to trade with the Iroquois. It was white and purple beads made from clams. But the thing about it is that wampum was actually legal tender in most of the colonies, in Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts. So colonists used it to trade with each other. Cash, as I was saying, was hard to come by in those days. But there's no record of any Iroquois or Algonquian speaker using it to trade with each other. Maybe people from different tribes who were involved with the beaver trade with the settlers. Instead, they used it to make treaties, to make promises, to arrange marriages, and to pay fines, which is a kind of giveaway of what happens with the origins of money. What is money? Money is a system where you can make proportional comparisons. You can say 27 of these equals 3 of these. It's hard to see how that could come out of a kind of system of gift exchange where you say nice cow. I mean, if somebody gives you something back which you think is not worth your cow, you might think the guy's a cheapskate. You might make fun of them. But you're not going to figure out a mathematical formula for exactly how cheap you think he is. Money seems to emerge when people are really angry. So it comes out of penalties and fines. If you have a fight and he gouges your eye out or kills your brother, that's when you start saying, hey, law says 27 heifers. Oh, you don't have heifers? Okay. How many silver plates equals 27 heifers? I want it exact, and they better be good ones. So that's the circumstance where you have exact proportions. And in fact, when you look at medieval law codes, it's very clear. I always quote the Welsh law codes where they could put a price on every single object in the average house, even though at that time there were no markets, so you couldn't buy most of those things. But it was all for paying penalties.
Well, you mentioned in passing there that there were no states, so therefore no markets. And I was just thinking of Milton Friedman, co-wrote a book, something like 600 pages, A Monetary History of the United States,
Oh, yes.
in which he pledged allegiance to the doctrine that money was totally insignificant, didn't matter, even though he was writing a 600-page book about it. But he then made one exception, which is when the state gets in there and screws things up. So his explanation of the Great Depression, for example, is that the Federal Reserve screwed things up. None of the other fundamental issues, inequality or reckless speculation or any of that sort of thing, massive increases in productivity without people having the means to purchase what they're able to produce. None of that interests Milton Friedman. It's just how the Federal Reserve screwed up. But you say, repeatedly through the book, that there are no markets without states.
Not that we know. Or insofar as there's markets that sort of are centered in states but go beyond them. For example, the Islamic Caliphate. But even then, they operate in completely different means. Where you have truly stateless societies, you don't have markets, unless they're sort of brought in from outside. And that's a fascinating thing, because it flies in the face of all of our accustomed ways of thinking. And we spent about 100 years thinking about the division between markets and governments, and that's sort of the big political stakes. It's the big historical, philosophical argument. It's a false dichotomy. In fact, you don't really find markets where you don't have states, or even really vice versa, you could argue.
Well, Europe created a money without a state.
Yes.
It hasn't worked out so well.
Yeah, well, I mean, Europe had a money without a state in the Middle Ages, too. They had a system of credit money. It was called imaginary money because it didn't really exist. But everybody continued to use first Roman denominations of currency to do credit transactions, and then later Carolingian ones. So like shillings and pence and so forth all go back to this money that Charlemagne intended to make but never actually did some of it. I think he minted some of it, but the larger denominations he never got around to. But it was still used as money. It was kind of within pretty much the zone of the EU.
But something changes with capitalism in money. I mean, we certainly you can draw these long parallels with credit money versus commodity money, and say these things have been around for thousands of years. But the system in which you produce commodities for sale in a market is qualitatively different from what went before it. How does money figure in that difference? What is it about capitalist money that's different from other kinds of money?
Well, okay, at first you have to look at the continuities. In order to see the differences, I think. I think that one of the really interesting things about capitalism, in certain ways, it actually is quite similar to the situation you see in the axial age empires, where money really comes out of the need to pay soldiers, or coin money. You have credit systems, as I say much earlier. So there is this whole art of statecraft. You see it in India, China, traces of it in Greece, where there's all these sort of techniques of profit-seeking through making war. And the interesting thing about capitalism is that you still have that relation between giant empires, war-making states, and money, and the idea that money should be gold and silver, since gold and silver tends to predominate, especially in periods of intense violence and empire. But at the same time, there is this strange hybrid relationship between the merchant and the warrior. I mean, Brodel really hit it, I think, hit the nail on the head when he tried to make the distinction between markets and capitalism. I mean, markets do seem to develop originally as a side effect of military operations. Brodel didn't say this, by the way, but this is the growing consensus of historians. But they develop independently on their own in certain circumstances, especially within states or between them. But what the ultimate spirit of a market system, according to Brodel, is a sort of commodity to money to commodity to another commodity. CMC prime is the famous formula. It's a way, if you have chickens and you want a cow, you can go about doing that through the medium of money. Now, capitalism, he says, is more MCM prime, using money via commodities to get more money, or just M to M prime, lending money. Just a variation on that. And this is the interesting point he makes, that you could well make an argument that rather than being an extension of the market or an inevitable product of the market or identical to the market, which is what we're now taught to think, in fact, capitalism is parasitical on the market. It's what happens when people with a lot of money who want to use it to turn it into more money ally with heads of state or powerful, usually rather violent political authorities, to create monopolies so that you can subvert the logic of the market, which is CMC, to turn it into MCM. You really need monopolies of one sort or another in order to do so. So that China is the great counterexample to what happened in Europe. Throughout almost all of its history, from the Han Dynasty at least, China was the ultimate anti-capitalist market state. They loved markets. They had markets that were much more developed than any place else in the world at the time. Higher standards of living as well. But those markets were tightly controlled by the government and sustained by the government, who hoarded various commodities in order to buy them up or release them to keep prices from getting out of hand. So they did the very opposite of what a monopolist would normally do, to manipulate prices and make money on the market. What happened in Europe, according to the Brodelians and the sort of world systems analysis people are coming out of this tradition, was that you had lots of little princes fighting it out, and you had this feudal system, all these cracks and holes in it, where merchants could kind of grab hold of these autonomous city-states, where they could make their own laws. Venice, Genoa, the Italian city-states came first, the Hanseatic League. So the financiers had a huge political advantage because the princes were all competing for resources, and they eventually started granting them these incredible monopolistic advantages. So capitalism emerges from a strange alliance between war-making states and the financiers who ultimately make the profit off the deal.
Well, and how does the gold they got from their empires abroad figure into it?
Well, that's interesting. Actually, as I say, a lot of it only kind of passes through Europe and goes straight to Asia. That has a strange history, actually, because really the turn back from credit money to gold and silver as bullion money starts before the Americas are invented. It starts happening in Europe around 1450, but even more importantly, it starts happening in China. And the reason for that was this kind of outburst of market populism, which is something that happens every now and then in history where markets become autonomous. In China, it happened because the Mongols had used the system of paper money, and paper money starts as a credit system, and it's quickly nationalized. That's what they do in China. If they can't suppress an innovation, the government just starts doing it themselves. So they had this paper money system, but it becomes associated with this kind of caste system where people are stuck in certain occupations. Some people are soldiers, some people are craftsmen, some people are peasants. Very unpopular. When the Ming have a revolution, overthrow the Mongols, they try to maintain the system. Nobody likes it. There's all this independent silver mining. Peasants are run away, or creating this alternative cash economy, which is independent of the government. And finally, the government says, "Okay, fine, we'll get rid of all the caste stuff. You can pay your taxes in silver. We won't even coin money anymore. You just use that stuff that you're already using." Then they want to get as much silver into the country to keep taxes down. The problem is, it turns out there isn't much silver in China. And then they basically go through all the silver in Japan in about 20 years. They're looking around for new sources of silver just when the conquistadors happen to stumble into the New World. People have estimated, Kenneth Pomerantz, for example, that the Iberian colonies in the New World would never have been viable economically were it not for the fact that there was this enormous demand for silver coming out of China, which is eventually where the exports end up going. At first they go through Europe, and then they just start sending them directly across the Pacific when they found Manila. Now, a lot of that money passes through Europe, but it becomes the basis for credit instruments. The Iberian governments start putting these things called juros. People are just using paper money like crazy based on this bullion trade and speculation on the bullion trade. And that's what causes the massive inflation in Europe, which really paves the way for capitalism. Because in the period of after the Black Death, actually, people were doing fairly well in Europe economically. One of the great ironies of history, basically the number of working people goes way down by a third. Right?
Clears the slate. Right?
Clears the slate a little bit in terms of population.
It's like World War II.
Yeah. And suddenly wages shoot up. You can actually, the number of holidays is like the easiest way to see what's going on. I always say if you want to know how the class struggle is going in any particular time and place, look at how many days people have to work. In the 1450 in much of Europe, it was like maybe half the days of the year were holidays. And they were spending it all in these great carnivals and public celebrations of various kinds. Suddenly, with the infusion of the bullion, there's a huge inflation. And it's not just caused by gold and silver coming in, because as I say, most of it just passes through, but this creation of credit instruments which reallocates all the capital back to the sort of emerging bourgeoisie. And that crash in wages or wages being here a metaphor for generally what people get, because most people aren't actually wage laborers, really sets the stage for creating capitalism.
And I guess to conclude this part, since we're thinking in the long view, it's been 40 years and a week since Nixon shut the gold window, and we've been living in this world of perfect credit, pure credit money. We have another 460 years to go, or is this the end of the credit phase and we're moving to something else?
I say, well, the cycles are getting a little tighter, but not that much tighter. We've definitely got a few centuries of this one, I think.
Okay. All right, so I think we're ready for some questions. Anyone?
Do you want to take those? You're the moderator.
Richard? Wait for the microphone.
Okay. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Since I haven't read the book, did you? There are a number of references to currency in the Old Testament, and that much quoted verse about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is at least what I was taught was not. You get your eye gouged out. You arrange to have the gouger's eye gouged out. It's a monetary transaction that there is value that is owed, and then there are other references to other monetary transactions in which it's money as opposed to credit. Shekels or some type of currency that is a store of value, and that's about 3,000 years old?
Something like that. Okay. Your basis for saying shekels are currency is... that's the thing. We just assume that. But if there were shekel coins, we would have found them. In fact, coinage shows up almost simultaneously in China, India, and the Eastern Mediterranean sometime later. Now, the reason why it's confusing is that we're used to assuming that when people are talking about denominations of money, there's actually something physically there. And sometimes there was. People would weigh out silver on occasion. Money really begins in the ancient Middle East as an equivalence between grain and silver. A certain measure of this equals that, and you use that to measure everything else. Now, the question is how people are actually paying each other. The thing that I thought was the big giveaway is that the Sumerians actually didn't make scales accurate enough. They had the technology to do so, but they didn't bother making scales accurate enough to measure out the tiny amounts of silver that would have been required to buy sort of pots and pans and everyday things like that. So somehow they were getting them in some other way. If you look at what happens in lots of markets around the world, they do have a credit system. They use silver as a way of denominating debt, and shekel is a weight. Shekel comes from Sumer. That weight system actually comes from a ration system used in temples. It's the amount of silver that corresponds with the amount a worker will eat in a month of grain. So it starts as a measure, but in fact, a dollar is the same thing. It's a measure. It's not a physical object. You can have something worth $1, or you can have a coin that is worth exactly $1. But as Mitchell Innes, the famous credit theorist of money, said, no one's ever touched $1 any more than anybody's ever touched a pound or an inch. It's a measure.
Well, there's that holy trinity of money: unit of account, medium of exchange, store of value.
Right, and economists tend to assume that the medium comes first, but and the people who assume that it starts as a unit of account, chartalists, credit theorists, are always considered almost crackpots. They're not exactly crackpots, but they're considered off to the side, an interesting substrain of economics, definitely not mainstream, except by archaeologists and historians, since all evidence indicates that they're right.
Well, what about the ethics, the necessity to pay a worker on a daily basis?
Yes, but with what? You don't need currency. You pay them grain, usually. The thing is, once you have a system of measurement, you can pay them anything that they'll agree to be paid.
Is it true that the word salary comes from the Roman soldier paid in salt? Is that true, or is that another one they say
right.
people made up?
No, it is true, but they didn't pay them just in salt. There was a salt ration.
How hard to live on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Richard?
You mentioned, you talked briefly about the IMF, and around that same time of virtual money in the 1970s, a lot of things that people used to, in the third world, that people used to pay for are now monetized, and it's actually happened really rapidly and really suddenly over the last 30 years.
This is true.
And you talked a little bit about this in your in the radio interview with Doug. What I wanted to ask was, and when you mentioned that, the question that sprung in my mind is, how much of that had to be imposed by the force of the state, and how much of that was just markets spreading sort of on their own accord? Because you say that there's no markets without a state, and should I be viewing this as a creation of new markets, these monetization, or is it just a different way of looking at something that's already been going on?
Well, that's a really interesting history. In fact, one way that we've been able to reconstruct what must have happened in the far past is looking at the history of the colonial world. Because even though the economists had this theory that money would arise spontaneously, and the chartalist theories that say money is a unit of accounting imposed by the state through taxation was considered marginal, what those guys actually did when they went out in the colonial world was exactly what the chartless said. I know the history of Madagascar best because I spent some years there. In Madagascar, it was quite clear when French government took over Madagascar. First thing they said is, well, we're going to have a economically self-financing colony, and anyway, you owe us a lot of money for the cost of the expedition we just outfitted to conquer you. So, these armies don't come cheap. So we're going to impose a tax, and you have to pay that tax, this is critical, in the money we will now coin. And they actually called it the moralizing tax, teach them the value of work. The educational tax, it was sometimes called, but not because it was to pay for education, which they didn't provide much of. It was educational in itself. But the idea was that, and they were very careful about this. They said, we need to make sure people, after they pay their tax, they have to go to work on the plantation or grow pineapples or coffee or whatever it is to sell in the market, get them into the market. But then we got to make sure they have a little bit left over. Because and then we set up little shops who are both the loan sharks. They were Indian on one coast and Chinese on the other, and bring these shopkeepers. But make sure they have enough that they can, start buying lipstick and parasols and candies and, nice little things, and they'll get hooked. This is very self-conscious. I mean, they wrote about this all the time. And it was very clear that a lot of Malagasis knew exactly what was going on. I mean, most people aren't dumb. They were on to what the administrators were doing. So for many years, a lot of them just refused. They would just pool all the money left over and buy cattle to sacrifice to their ancestors and just not go near the shops at all. But eventually, after centuries, a century, how long can you keep up resistance when that's the only game in town? It was very self-conscious. And it answers, once you understand what was going on, they were trying to create markets, and particularly labor markets in this case. It becomes, you can realize one of the great mysteries, if you believe the Adam Smith version of history of where money comes from, it's spontaneously created from below, was why did ancient kings want taxes and money at all? Because if it's gold and silver just is money, well, they can just grab the gold and silver mines. They got all the money. Why do they need more? And what's the point of taking it? Then you just stamp your picture on it, you give it to people, and you say, okay, everybody give it back. Doesn't make a lot of sense. However, if you're trying to create a market, and particularly if you're trying to create a market to pay for soldiers, it makes perfect sense. Because the big problem you have is here's 40,000 guys, how are you going to feed them? They're going to eat everything, within a mile or two of where they're living, immediately. So if you don't want to have marauding bands of soldiers attacking your own community, you've got to employ another 40,000 people to feed all those guys. Unless you just take little bits of gold and silver, which is what they're going to be looting anyway, so they're used to handling. Stamp your picture on it, give it to the soldiers, and say, okay, everybody in the kingdom has to give me one back. Suddenly you're employing everybody in the kingdom as people providing soldiers with things they want or need. But at the same time, you're creating markets. So the first marketplaces that use cash tend to develop around armies and military operations.
Just to follow up,
Yeah.
fast forwarding to this.
Wait for the microphone.
Right.
Fast forwarding to the 1970s and the more recent time, a lot of these are in these states that are most neoliberal and that most monetarized things that previously had not been were actually not directly in the colonial grip. They like parts of Africa or these are sort of in the post-colonial era, and yet they still moved into adopted neoliberal policies. No longer had free services that were offered by the state before that. How did that happen?
Well, that largely through the IMF. I mean, they had a neoliberal orthodoxy that was just simply imposed directly. I mean, I turned to Madagascar. Madagascar has had two, or by some accounts, 3 nonviolent revolutions in the last 20 years. The first one they had, the guy who was put in power thought he was actually running the place. So he went to the IMF, which, they'd kicked out the previous theory he was allied with North Korea, but he knew enough about power to do whatever the IMF told him. They kicked out that guy. The new guy, who was like a brain surgeon or something, he wasn't a professional politician, went to the IMF and said, well, name one country that did what you said, poor country that did what you say and is now rich. And they said, shut up and do what you're told. He said no. He didn't sign an IMF treaty. And if you don't have an IMF treaty, the World Bank won't give you money. If the World Bank won't give you money, you don't get American aid. If you don't get American aid, you can't get export credits. So basically, it was the economic equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb on the place. People died. they have that power to do that to people who don't play along.
Then, of course, you go back to the New York City fiscal crisis. Felix Roten here said they had to start charging tuition at City University. That had been free under municipal referendums in 1847, I think they conducted it. And Felix said, I know this is not fiscally important, but it's important for the shock value.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really, it's also, whereas Margaret Thatcher said, we need to remake people's souls. There's a bit of soul remaking going on.
Yeah, and that's why I think a jubilee would be really helpful, because it would do exactly the opposite. I mean, it would be a real shock value, but it would be a way of telling us, okay, after 2008, we learned that money is just something we make up. It can be reshuffled any old way. Well, let's bring that home.
Hi there. Thanks so much. It was really great. A quick question: is debt an invention that is just really neat that somebody came upon once, and then it diffused throughout the world, or is it something that is permanent and everywhere? So, in your research, did you find, say, I don't know, Hawaii comes to mind as a place that wasn't involved in the world economy until much, much later? Did you? Wasn't it discovered in 1788 or 1778 or something? And so, did they have debt? Like, is it something that everyone does, or is it something that spreads? And if not, what would it is that open up the possibility of a debtless society?
Well, I guess that depends on how strictly you want to define the term. Normally, when I think of debt, I think of a moral obligation that has been, as I say in the book, perverted by numbers and violence. But to put it somewhat less poetically, it's an obligation which can be exactly quantified, and which is depersonalized. It's not between two people, but between whoever the debt is owed to. You can transfer it. Now, there are definitely places that do not have quantifiable and transferable obligations. I don't think it's a human universal. I think that it's a potential human universal in that it's a concept that could be easily understood in any context. It's sufficient. It's sort of like money. I mean, it would be hard to eliminate money of any sort, because if you imagine money as just a way of comparing values of things in a proportional fashion, it's an idea anybody could understand easily enough. So it's a universal in that sense. It doesn't seem to occur absolutely everywhere, but that people make proportional calculations like that. But once it's there, it's hard to imagine it would be completely gotten rid of. But I think the key thing is not to assume that any time people are making promises to each other, even promises involving material things, that's a debt, and therefore debt is universal, because then you assume that the rest of the package just sort of naturally flows out of it, and I don't think that's the case.
I think we have time for one brief question and answer.
Hey, this is since we're just coming out of this housing crisis where we witness a...
We're coming out of it?
We are? I didn't know.
I'm out. I don't know about you guys. Good luck to everybody else. We saw the rise of easy access to debt pushing up this idea of increased value. Do you have any more anecdotes from more ancient history where that same thing has happened?
Which aspect now again?
Well, easy access to credit, buying houses, pushing
Right.
up the value of the houses, the supposed value of houses, but it was based on easy access to credit.
Oh, you mean the sort of fluctuating system where the scams? Yes, scams are prevalent in all of human history. Yeah. Yes, I mean that's why you have these forms of economic regulation, because the debt trap is something that's just very easy to fall into. And you look in the Bible, you look in almost anywhere. People with lots of money will figure out ways to trap people into debt. If you take that Brodelian idea that capitalism is just a way of manipulating the market, once those institutions are there, people will always try that kind of thing. And hence, one reason why religious codes are so strict about ensuring that it doesn't happen. The idea that you can have a market and people will not fall into that is utopian. I always think a utopian argument is one where when you say how things should work and then it doesn't, you say, well, it's the individuals who are to blame. Well, the economic system is built for individuals as they actually exist, and individuals as they actually exist, if you set up a system, will both make scams and fall for them. This we historically know.
All right, I think that's it. Thanks, David.
Thank you.